Before there were kingdoms, borders, or even the idea of Europe, there was the Balkan Peninsula, carved not just by rivers and stone, but by time itself. During the Ice Age, as glaciers swallowed most of the continent in silence, a few ancient humans found shelter here, in caves, valleys, and the deep forested ridges of what we now call the Balkans. This wasn't just survival, it was preservation. These early humans didn't leave behind monuments. They left something far more powerful: DNA. Specifically, mitochondrial lineages, passed from mother to daughter, that still pulse through the blood of people living here today. That's tens of thousands of years of genetic memory unbroken. In a world where migrations and conquests wiped out so many ancient populations, how did these lineages endure here? The answer lies in the land itself. The Balkans were a glacial refugium, a sanctuary. Its mountains weren't just obstacles. They were vaults. They kept ancient bloodlines alive, while the rest of Europe transformed beyond recognition. Then a new wave arrived, not with swords, but with seeds. Around 6500 BCE, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia crossed into southeastern Europe, carrying with them wheat, cattle, pottery, and genes. In most of Europe, these early farmers replaced the local foragers. But here, something strange happened. Instead of conquest, there was connection. The newcomers blended with the locals, forming a genetically diverse and culturally unique population, a fusion of Mesolithic foragers and Anatolian cultivators. Their children carried markers from both worlds, Y chromosome haplogroups like G2A and J2 from Anatolia, and traces of older, Paleolithic genes that had lingered in the mountains for millennia. It was not a genetic overwrite, it was a genetic conversation, one of the oldest in Europe. This blended population laid the foundations for everything to come. They were not a dead end. They were a beginning. The genetic roots of Illyrians, Thracians, even the future Slavic-speaking Balkan peoples can be traced back, in part, to this fusion. And remarkably, their DNA still shows up today, despite every invasion, every empire, every name change. So here's the question. How does a bloodline survive the collapse of time itself? Is it terrain, chance, or something deeper in human memory? Something that insists on continuity? Maybe your own DNA holds part of that answer. And if you're wondering what happens when Bronze Age warriors, Roman settlers, and Slavic tribes all add their stories to this ancient thread, just wait. This was only the first layer. If we could peel back the layers of the Balkan soil, not just the earth, but time itself, what stories would we find beneath? Not myths, not empire names written in textbooks, but bones, burial mounds, the whispers of entire peoples whose names have nearly vanished from maps, but whose DNA lives on in millions today. Before Greece rose, before Rome ruled, before Slavic words echoed through these valleys, the Balkans were home to civilizations whose identities were forged in stone, copper, and blood. The Illyrians in the west, the Thracians in the east. Fierce, fragmented, mysterious. We rarely talk about them in school. They're often footnotes in ancient history. But genetics tells us something extraordinary. These so-called lost peoples never truly vanished. They live on, inside modern bodies, particularly in Albanians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and parts of the Western Balkans. How is that possible? The answer lies in the male line, the Y chromosome. In places where written records are silent, this one microscopic thread speaks. When researchers tested ancient remains from Thracian graves in Bulgaria, a pattern emerged. Over and over again, they found haplogroup E13, a genetic signature that still pulses strongly in today's Balkans, especially among Albanians and mainland Greeks. In fact, some of the highest frequencies of EV13 anywhere in the world are found in Kosovo and northern Albania. That's not coincidence. That's survival. Meanwhile, in the lands once ruled by Illyrian tribes, Albania, Montenegro, coastal Croatia, another signature appears, J2B, L283. It's been found in ancient Bronze Age remains from the Cetina culture, and it still shows up consistently in modern Albanians and Western Balkan populations. Some researchers even propose that modern Albanians are the most direct descendants of Illyrian tribes, not just culturally, but biologically. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you're from this region, or your ancestors were? What blood still moves through your veins? Is it possible that you carry the memory of people's history barely remembers? And yet, these weren't empires in the classical sense. There were no marble capitals, no scroll-filled libraries. These were tribal societies, fractured, fiercely independent, often at war with each other. But their genetic legacy proved stronger than their political unity. They passed on not just tools and oral myths, but DNA that would resist replacement through conquest after conquest. It's strange to think, isn't it, that ancient tribal chieftains who lived 3,000 years ago may have more direct biological descendants today than Roman senators ever did. But here's what's even more remarkable. The blending didn't stop when Rome arrived. Instead of erasing these pre-Roman lineages, the empire merely added to the mosaic. The Illyrians and Thracians didn't disappear. They adapted, married, moved to new valleys, and their descendants kept living on, generation after generation, long after their names stopped appearing on maps. So next time someone tells you about ancient history, ask yourself, how ancient is it really, if it's still alive in your blood? This isn't mythology. It's science. It's genetics. It's legacy in the most literal sense of the word. And if your family comes from Albania, Greece, Western Bulgaria, or the coastlines of Montenegro and Croatia, there's a good chance part of this story is already inside you. But we're just getting started, because soon an empire would arrive, not with origins in the Balkans, but from across the sea. One that would build roads, rewrite gods, and bury its dead alongside Balkan tribesmen. The Roman footprint is next, and it leaves far more than ruins. Imagine this. You're walking through a ruined Roman city in the Balkans, marble columns toppled, ancient roads buried beneath modern asphalt. But what if I told you the real story of Rome in this region isn't in the stones? It's in the bones. For centuries, we've been taught a familiar tale. Rome came, conquered, and remade the Balkans in its image. But DNA tells a stranger truth. The Roman Empire didn't replace the people here. It joined them. And the traces it left are not always where you'd expect. The Roman presence in the Balkans begins in the 1st century BCE. Legions marched in. Cities were built. Latin spread. But when scientists examined the ancient DNA of individuals buried in Roman-era cemeteries across the Balkans, a surprising pattern emerged. These weren't Italians. They were Anatolians. From Macedonia to Serbia, Roman graves reveal skeletons with genetic roots in what is now Turkey. Not Rome, not Italy. Soldiers, merchants, freed slaves, administrators, many came from the eastern provinces of the empire, carrying genes that would become woven into the Balkan fabric. And they didn't just pass through. They stayed, married, had children. Their ancestry, Mediterranean, Levantine, Anatolian, fused with the local gene pool. One grave in Viminatium tells a quiet story. A local Balkan man, buried beside a woman from deep within Anatolia. Not a tale written in marble, but one recorded in DNA. By the 3rd century CE, roughly a quarter of the genetic makeup in Balkan populations can be traced to these eastern Mediterranean migrants. That's not colonization, that's integration. And it's a legacy still visible in today's genomes. So where are the Italians? That's the twist. Despite Rome's enormous cultural footprint, aqueducts, amphitheaters, laws, genetic footprints from the Italian peninsula are shockingly rare in this region. The idea of Romanization here was more about symbols than settlers. Latin inscriptions, Roman dress codes, imperial architecture, all adopted by locals, without large-scale population replacement. It challenges everything we thought we knew about imperial expansion. In the Balkans, Rome didn't wipe the slate clean. It added new ink, without erasing the old. And if you're wondering how far Rome's reach extended, consider this. Researchers even found isolated cases of North African ancestry in Roman Balkan graves. Yes, from Africa. This wasn't just an empire of territory. It was an empire of movement. A frontier where cultures, languages, and genes collided. Think about that for a second. A tribal Thracian lineage from 1200 BCE, intermarrying with a Roman-era woman descended from Anatolian merchants, and their descendants later intermixing with Slavic tribes? That's not a melting pot. That's a genetic palimpsest, layer after layer of ancestry, none completely erased. So the next time someone says Rome built civilization in the Balkans, ask them, which Rome? The one on maps, or the one in our blood? And what about your blood? If you've ever traced your DNA back to southeastern Europe, do you know if some part of you comes from a merchant born in ancient Cappadocia, or a frontier soldier stationed at the edge of empire? Because the ruins may be quiet now, but the genes are still speaking. And what happens when that empire falls? When the legions leave and a new kind of migration begins, not of soldiers, but of tribes from the north and east. That chapter changed everything. And the Slavic migrations are coming next. What happens when an entire people moves, not as warriors, but as families? Not to conquer, but to stay. Around the 6th century CE, something massive and permanent swept across the Balkans. A human tide from the northeast. And it didn't just leave footprints. It rewrote the genetic language of an entire region. They were Slavs. But they didn't come as a single, unified group. They arrived as scattered tribes, migrating slowly, but relentlessly from the steppes and forests of Eastern Europe. And unlike many migrations before them, they weren't absorbed. This time, they did the absorbing. You might assume it was violent, but the genetic evidence tells a subtler story. A story of settlement, not slaughter. Their DNA didn't erase what came before. It blended with it, forming something entirely new, yet grounded in layers that stretched back millennia. Ancient DNA from early medieval Balkan graves shows a rising presence of R1A and I2A, Y chromosome haplogroups common among Slavic-speaking populations. But what's fascinating isn't just their arrival, it's how deeply they took root. In northern regions like Serbia, Croatia, and Bulgaria, up to 60% of male ancestry today traces back to this Slavic influx. That's enormous. But here's where it gets interesting. The impact wasn't equal. The farther south you go, the weaker the Slavic footprint becomes. In mainland Greece, it drops to about 30 to 40%. On the southern islands of the Aegean, sometimes as low as 4 to 20%. Why? Geography. The same mountains and coastlines that protected ancient foragers now slowed the pace of change. It was like history unfolding at different speeds, north racing forward, south holding tight to the past. So now ask yourself, if you're from the Balkans, or descended from the region, how much of your blood comes from this massive medieval transformation? Could your surname, your grandfather's eyes, your accent trace back to a village that didn't exist before the 600s? And yet, what's even more powerful than these numbers is what didn't happen. The Slavs didn't wipe out the Illyrians, or erase the Thracians. Instead, they married into local families, learned the terrain, adopted customs, even kept some local words and burial practices. This wasn't conquest, it was continuity, reimagined. A reshaping, not a replacement. And something else happened too. As Slavic tribes settled across the peninsula, a cultural shift began. Language changed. Place names transformed. But at the genetic level, the core remained Balkan. In many villages today, you'll find people with Slavic last names, carrying pre-Slavic haplogroups. That's the paradox. People changed what they called themselves, but not who they were. It's easy to think of identity as fixed, as either or. But the Balkans teach us it's almost always and. You can be Slavic-speaking and Illyrian descended. You can carry genes from Ukraine and memories from a mountain that's had the same name for 3,000 years. So the next time someone tells you where they're from, ask them, do you mean by passport or by chromosomes? And here's the twist that few talk about. The Slavic migrations weren't the last. They were only one phase in a genetic kaleidoscope, because soon the region would enter another transformation, this time under the shadow of the crescent moon. The Ottoman era changed borders, cultures, and yes, even DNA. What happens when the sun sets on one empire and rises on another? For the Balkans, history didn't stop with Rome or the Slavs. It shifted again, this time under a new symbol, the crescent. The Ottomans didn't just redraw maps, they left traces in language, architecture, faith, and yes, even in our genes. But how deep was that imprint really? From the 15th to the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire held vast stretches of the Balkans under its rule. Cities were transformed. Minarets rose where temples once stood. Trade routes pulsed with goods from Anatolia, Persia, and the Levant. But the most enduring exchanges weren't material, they were biological. Now here's the twist. Genetic studies show that the Ottoman occupation did leave a mark, but far less than you might expect from 4 centuries of dominance. In fact, compared to the earlier Slavic migrations, the Ottoman genetic imprint is almost subtle. Almost. In modern Balkan populations, a detectable strand of Anatolian and Near Eastern ancestry exists, particularly in urban areas of Bulgaria, Macedonia, and parts of Kosovo. Genome-wide comparisons reveal shared DNA segments between Balkan groups and modern-day Turks, hinting at historical intermarriage, conversions, and small-scale population movements. But when you zoom out, it's not overwhelming. It's like a faint echo in a loud room. Why wasn't the impact stronger? The answer lies in geography, again. The same mountains that had once shielded foragers from the Ice Age and resisted Roman roads now dulled the force of Ottoman integration. In places like rural Albania, Montenegro, and the interior highlands, communities remained isolated, self-governed, fiercely independent. These mountain enclaves became genetic time capsules. In fact, one of the most striking genetic anomalies in Europe today is found in Kosovo, a sky-high frequency of EV13, a Y-DNA haplogroup linked to ancient Balkan populations. Why so concentrated? Because in these mountainous zones, intermarriage remained local for centuries. It's a classic case of genetic drift, when a small population's DNA becomes amplified over time, simply because they stayed put. Think about that. While empires rose and fell outside, entire bloodlines inside these valleys remained untouched, like a sealed room in a burning house. But elsewhere, the Ottoman era didn't go unnoticed. Some converted to Islam. Others were forcibly relocated. Janissaries, elite Ottoman soldiers, were often recruited as children from Balkan Christian families. These were boys raised far from their ancestral homes, trained in Turkish language and customs, and later sent back to rule the very villages their families once fled. Imagine what that does to identity, to ancestry, to memory. Does your family come from a city or a village? Does your surname sound Slavic, Greek, or Turkish? Have you ever wondered if one of your ancestors was a janissary, or a mountain farmer who never once left his valley? Genetics doesn't care about flags. It records migrations, unions, and isolations, silently, permanently. And when you compare DNA across today's Balkans, you start to see a pattern. The Ottoman imprint is there, but layered lightly over much older foundations. It added spice, not structure. So while Turkish ancestry does appear in Balkan genomes, especially in areas once closely tied to the empire, it never defined a region. The Balkans weren't overwritten. They were seasoned. Now we've seen Ice Age refuges, Bronze Age warriors, Roman merchants, and Slavic settlers, and now Ottoman shadows. But one question remains. Despite all these waves, how is it that people who speak different languages and follow different religions can still be genetically nearly identical? That's the final mystery, and it's waiting in our last chapter. Zoom in on a modern map of the Balkans, and you'll see borders like stitches across a scar. Croatia, Serbia, Albania, Greece, Bosnia. Different alphabets, different flags, different wars. But what if we zoomed out not in miles, but in millennia? What would happen if you stripped away religion, language, and politics, and just listened to the DNA? The result is shocking, because underneath centuries of conflict, nationalism, and division, the people of the Balkans are more alike than they are different. Genetically, they share something deeper than history, a common origin. In a region defined by fracture, the real story is one of continuity. Genetic studies comparing modern South Slavic populations, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Montenegrins, show a level of similarity so high, it's practically indistinguishable. Despite different religions, despite civil wars, despite borders drawn and redrawn. Why? Because while cultures change in generations, genes take thousands of years to shift. And the gene pool here was shaped long before anyone spoke Slavic, or bowed to Rome, or converted under the Ottomans. It was shaped by mountains, rivers, and migrations that bound people together, even when their flags disagreed. So how does that make sense in a place where the past feels so tribal? Let's go deeper. Autosomal DNA, the part you inherit from both parents, shows that Balkan populations sit on a unique bridge between East and West. They don't cluster with Western Europeans, and they're not fully Eastern either. They hover between, reflecting a history of crossroads, not endpoints. It's the genetic echo of being a passage, not a destination. And then there's the mystery of the Armenians, a smaller Balkan group that stands apart even within this shared tapestry. Genetically, they carry a distinctive structure, hinting at more isolation, perhaps even ancient divergence. Who are they really? And what does their story tell us about the forgotten corners of the Balkans? Zoom in again. Greece, especially in its northern regions, shares more genetic signals with Bulgaria than with its own southern islands. Meanwhile, Albanians show strong continuity with Bronze Age populations, suggesting deeper roots than many had assumed. The mountain barrier didn't just separate invaders. It preserved memory. So ask yourself, when you think of the Balkans, do you picture a battlefield of cultures or a shared home passed through generations? Because in this region, diversity doesn't mean division. It means layering. Different tribes, same valleys, different tongues, shared ancestors. And the personal stories? They're just as surprising. One person in Serbia might discover a rare maternal haplogroup connected to early Neolithic settlers. Someone in Bosnia could carry genetic signatures tied to ancient Thracians. A family in Montenegro might find a paternal line that's remained in the same mountains for over 3,000 years. In a recent study, geneticists found Balkan people sharing identical biodescent segments with relatives in Slovakia, Poland, even Germany. Signs of past immigration, war, and trade. Our identities stretch farther than we think. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a region where genetics tells a different story than politics. A story of interconnectedness, of shared survival, of a common root beneath a divided canopy. Maybe you've done a DNA test. Maybe your results came back Balkan. But what does that really mean? It means you carry a history so old, it predates the names we now argue over. And as the science continues, one truth becomes clearer. In the Balkans, what unites people isn't what's on the surface. It's what runs underneath.